So today I will be analyzing Interview with a Vampire released in 1994. This film is told through an interview between this guy named Daniel and Brad Pitt's character who is a vampire whose name is Louis. This is told in the style of an epic and spans across like 2 centuries. It begins as early as when Louis first became a vampire after no longer wanting to be alive when he lost his wife and kids. Louis was bit by Tom Cruise's character whose name is Lestat. Much of the beginning of this film covers a kind of moral feud between these two characters because Lestat sees Louis as weak and naive for not wanting to kill humans, and Louis sees Lestat as heartless. Lestat later turns a young woman named Claudia into a vampire who Louis almost killed after his urges got the best of him and then they lived as a family for decades after she turned into a vampire. However, Claudia, who has very little self-control and murders pretty much anyone who she is attempts to murder Lestat. And there's a lot more that happens in this film, such as them looking for other vampires and going to a vampire society, and there's confrontations with Lestat later in the film. However, ultimately, this can be wrapped up by saying that this is a vampire epic that spans a very long time. We can see that this is a horror film through the types of monsters present. This is a new age vampire film where the vampires are protagonists and prey on the humans in the film. The only vampire who really seems to see humans as being more than just food for most of the film is Louis. The vampires in this film also have a very predatory nature, just as many of the vampires who came before them. Along with there being vampires, there's also classic vampire iconography, such as the coffins that the vampires sleep in. Furthermore, there is a lot of blood in this film. At times I was pretty shocked at the amount of blood. There was this one scene where Claudia cuts Lestat's throat and the blood is pouring out on the carpet for a very long time. I think this is probably the most shocking moment involving blood, but there was a ton throughout the entire film from all of the humans who were killed by the main characters who are vampires. Additionally, this film can very easily be read as a queer film. The dynamic between Louis and Lestat is incredibly queer-coded. We can see this from the scenes of Louis being turned into a vampire by Lestat when Lestat bites his neck, or when he lays on top of Louis while letting him drink his blood. There's also another scene of Lestat sucking the blood of another man who also seems to be a queer-coded character. Also, just the entire dynamic of them having a vampire family together with Lestat and Louis both being the father to Claudia is pretty queer-coded. Lestat wanted to start a vampire family with Louis, and then this dynamic just continued for 30 or 40 years. So I think this is very, very clearly a queer-coded movie. Furthermore, as far as the class concepts we can examine through this film, we can look at the return of the vampire as a result of the AIDS crisis, a crisis which became as horrible as it did due to the Reagan administration refusing to invest in health funding for the disease. This relates to vampires because during the AIDS crisis, there was a fear of blood due to the transmission of HIV through blood. This led to a lot of horror directors creating vampire films due to the transmission of blood between a vampire and a human and vice versa as a part of the vampire mythology. There is a ton of blood being transferred from characters to characters throughout this film. For example, in one of the early scenes, Lestat drips his blood into Louis' mouth. I really like the overall premise of this film. The idea of a vampire's epic spanning over a long period of time with the vampires as the protagonist of the film seems like a really intriguing idea with a lot of potential. I do not believe, however, that this film necessarily did this idea justice because it didn't dive into enough detail about the implications of the different decades and how humanity and their values at different periods affected the vampires. I also really like the practical effects and how they were combined with visual effects. I do not believe all instances of this aged well, but I do think for the time it was made, it was done really well. For example, the design of Lestat after Claudia tried to murder him, I thought was pretty frightening and really well done. Ultimately, I do not have strong negative or positive emotions about this film. I liked some of the more campy elements, and I really love the premise of the film, but I felt like it felt short in fleshing out some of its best ideas. One thing I definitely felt, though, was entertained. Even though this was not one of my favorite films we have watched for this class, I really enjoyed its campiness, its solid practical effects, and the interesting premise kept me engaged. I would definitely, even though this wasn't like my favorite, I would definitely recommend this to people who are like fans of either campy horror films or vampire films. Thank you.